I'm talking about responsive web design this session because I go to quite a number of events and conferences, and after a while I began to realize that almost every other session I attended, there would be a speaker at the front showing a web page in a browser and then grabbing the corner of the browser and making it bigger and smaller to show what happens. So I thought, well, if everyone's talking about this, it must be quite important. And I then took the step of actually ensuring that the website that I'm responsible for is responsive. And that required me, of course, to do a little bit of research, find out about responsive web design, and to put it into practice. And the fact that I was able to do it myself, and I'm not a programmer, I'm not a professional coder, I'm a technical communicator just like yourselves who will dabble, with code when necessary, and I managed to do it. So it's an important subject, and it's within all of our grasps. And I'm here today to talk about what it is, to talk about how I made sure that my website was responsive, and I'll just give you some examples. There will be some code, but don't worry. The detail of the code is not important, and it's not that difficult. And then I'm going to talk about tools, because many of you won't want to dig into the code and will want all your tools to handle this sort of thing for you. So that's the plan. Oh, this is who I am. I'm a freelance consultant and trainer. Well, freelance, I work for UA Europe, but UA Europe is a small company, and I offer training and consultancy on various tools and technologies, including RoboHelp and Flare and other authoring tools. And I also run a conference every year called UA Europe. And in fact, it's the UA Europe conference website that I'm going to be using as my case study for today. These are the questions that I'm going to attempt to answer. We'll talk a little bit about what responsive web design is. I'm assuming that most of you, since you've decided to come to the session, probably know roughly what it is, but we'll just do a quick recap on that. I'll talk about some of the key related concepts. We'll then get slightly technical. But don't worry, there's actually very limited technology behind this whole thing. There's only 3 things you need to know about, and we can cover them very quickly. Then I'll talk about how I put those into practice on my website. And finally, I'll give you a quick survey of what the tools enable you to do, or what some of the tools enable you to do. So let's talk about responsive web design, first of all. I've tried to define it here. What it means is designing a website or some web-based content so that it can be viewed on a range of different device sizes and types, and that it'll look good, it'll work well on all of those, and it'll play to the strengths of all those different devices. And of course, this is getting, you can understand why this is getting increasingly important. Rachel Johnston gave an excellent session on mobile user assistance this morning. I picked up loads of things which I've made a note of. And one of the things she talked about was the sort of new generation of consumers for whom the mobile browser is really their only way of consuming web content. The term responsive web design was coined by this developer, Ethan Marcotte. He's looking very pleased with himself there, isn't he, having coined the term. He wrote an article where he discussed these concepts, and he called it responsive web design. I provided a link to that article in the references at the end of these slides. And of course, I'll make these slides available for you so you can just click on that link. Now, let me talk about what this means. We want to make things responsive. We want to make it viewable on many different sizes of screens and devices. So what does that mean in terms of what the site will do? Well, the idea is that as the viewport, that's a glossary term. That's why I put it in bold. Viewport is the is the display area of your browser. So it's the sort of window of the browser that excludes the toolbar at the top and the status bar at the bottom. It's the sort of window within which your content will be presented. So the idea is that as the size, the dimensions of that viewport changes, any images that you've got within your content will resize automatically. So it won't be that they'll stay fixed, and as the window gets smaller, you've then got to scroll across to see the images. The images will just shrink to remain within that viewport area. Not only that, but your content, your text content, will also resize automatically, even if you have your content in 2 or 3 different columns. You've got 2 or 3 columns of text. Those columns will just shrink in the same way as the images will shrink. And in fact, what might happen beyond a certain point, and these points are called breakpoints. This is another glossary term in bold, you see. At specific points which you can define, the layout will actually change. So that means that if your device size gets smaller and smaller, or you make the browser window smaller and smaller, suddenly it'll get to a point where multi-columns is no longer appropriate, and what you need is just a single column layout, which will work well on a mobile device or in a small browser area. Not only that, but your navigation controls may change position. So instead of having a panel on the left, you might end up with a sort of toolbar at the top. Sorry about the jumping screen. I'm not sure if there's anything we can do about that. And there may be some parts of the content which actually kind of just disappear altogether because they don't work well or they're not appropriate for a mobile device. Or maybe even some elements appear, because another of the brilliant things what Rachel said this morning is that mobile devices have superpowers that you can take advantage with in your content. The fact that mobile devices often are able to detect their location and whether there are certain people in the neighborhood or what your heart rate is or whatever. So you may want to add in certain content which is intelligently fed by those capabilities. So let me show you a couple of examples. And I'll show you these live. I'll try to anyway, see if this works. I've got a browser window open here. This is the UA Europe conference website. And this is exactly what it looked like a year ago. Now, since then, I have made it responsive. But that has absolutely not one iota, or makes not an iota of difference to what you see when you're in the desktop view. So I've pretty much left the design and the basic code of the website unchanged. All I've done is kind of retrofitted some code that will make it responsive, and it was surprisingly easy to do, and I'll talk about that later. So what happens now is when you make the browser window smaller, and I'm now round about that breakpoint I talked about. Just there, round about here, is where I've reached the width where in my code I've said, if the viewport is narrower than that, it doesn't make sense to have that left-hand panel. And you now have, that's more or less how this site would look on a mobile phone. And you can scroll up and down. You can see the image there of the venue, the hotel, it fits nicely on the screen. And as I squeeze, the window resizes. Actually, it doesn't appear to be doing that there. Not sure why that is, so let's have a look at another site quickly. Here's the Microsoft site. Same deal. I only built one breakpoint into my site. I decided that I want to distinguish between people viewing on a desktop and on a mobile phone. But if you look at Microsoft.com, you'll find that it's very fluid, that I can't really show you the site in its full glory because I don't have very high resolution screen here because of the projector. So if you had a high-res screen, you'd probably see more of the site here. But as I go down in size and I reach down to a sort of tablet type layout, you see the images this time are getting smaller. Just at that break point, the block of information about the surface disappeared and went beneath the image. And as I get smaller again, suddenly the navigation, the main navigation items become drop-downs, which I can use on my mobile phone. Pretty much all the content that was available for desktop view is still there if you scroll down far enough. I haven't actually lost any information going from desktop to mobile. It's just arranged in a different way. It's single column instead of multi-column. And by the way, as we saw things change, we're not downloading any different information. I've already downloaded information. All we're doing is changing the CSS, changing the styles that reposition and reformat the content. That's what makes it responsive. And finally, just to relate this to documentation, which most of you will be interested in, here is a very nice documentation site. This is the online documentation for Barracuda Backup. This is what it would look like on your desktop computer. And you've got access to all the different parts of the Barracuda site here, the home page, other products, support site. You can search the documentation. You've got a nice sort of expanding and collapsing table of contents on the left. But again, as I make the viewport width narrower, let's do that now. In fact, sorry, let's go out again and make it narrower. You see, first of all, just at that break point, if you watch the items on the left there, these navigation items go. They're replaced by a menu over here on the right, a drop-down menu. If I use that, I then have access to the same navigation items. In fact, this is the only way now to access the search. I think that's a mistake. The search is now only available if you click the menu button. I would like the search to have been a bit more prominent, as it was on the Microsoft site. On the Microsoft site, the search was always there on the right-hand side. But as I carry on making the viewport narrower, now you see the left-hand pane disappears, but the two columns are just resizing and still more or less work even at this narrow width. So those are three good examples, apart from my non-resizing image, of responsive web content. I've given you slides for each of those. You can check them out yourselves. Some of the key issues related to this. You may have heard the term graceful degradation and progressive enhancement. Those are kind of two options you have. You either start with a sort of full-blown site which you design for the desktop, which has all the bells and whistles, and then you think, as the screen gets smaller, what do I need to kind of strip out, or how do I deal with the screen being smaller? How do I represent it in a way that will work for mobile? The danger there is you start arbitrarily just eliminating content, because you think, oh well, on a mobile screen we only got a small screen. Perhaps we can ditch the such and such option. And as Rachel was saying earlier, if you make arbitrary decisions like that, you end up annoying users because the things you ditch are the very things they're interested in, and they end up going to trying to view the full website on their mobile phone instead of your nice responsive site. So another alternative is that you start with the sort of basics with a mobile site, and you think, how do I enhance that, or how do I change that as the screen gets bigger? And in fact, there's a very popular and important philosophy called mobile first. This term was coined by a bloke called Luke Wroblewski in the States. He's written a book called Mobile First, and his theory and the belief of many developers is that you should actually focus on designing your content for mobile devices and then worry about the desktop later on. Think about how you adapt it for desktops. And that may seem a strange way around to you, but actually it really forces you to focus on what's important. And what's happened with a lot of big websites is they've sat down and think, how do we redesign this for mobile? And they've come up with a brilliant mobile site. And they've thought, hang on, if this works, if people are happy with this on mobile, maybe we didn't need all that extra fluff and all that extra text and all those extraneous images, and we can just strip them out and go for it. So there's actually been a trend towards much simpler, cleaner websites, even on desktop, as a result of this mobile-first philosophy. And of course, as Rachel said, another reason to put mobile first is that it won't be long, I believe, before more people are viewing web content on mobile phones than they are on desktops. And plus, remember, you've got the superpowers, which you can take advantage of, the capabilities of a mobile phone, which are often beyond the capabilities of a laptop. My laptop doesn't have an accelerometer on it, for example, or a heart rate monitor. Another way of viewing responsive web design is, and this is kind of the opposite extreme, and I found this quote when I was doing some research from a guy called Nicholas Johnson, and his view was, look, you shouldn't mess with the content. You shouldn't change what's presented to people, whether it's on desktop or mobile. All you're doing when you're adapting for a mobile screen or a small screen is you're just linearizing the layout. In other words, you're going from 3 columns or 4 columns to a single column, and you're making the hyperlinks easier to click on, buttonizing the navigation. It's quite difficult clicking on, certainly on inline links, blue underlined text with a big, thick finger on a phone, but if you can make nice big buttons for the navigation, that's great. So just linearizing and buttonizing, that was his view on what we mean by responsive web design. All right, now what's the technology behind all of this? How do we do it? It's actually very simple. I talked about resizing images. Well, that's dead simple. That's just one tiny bit of CSS. It's just that instead of, when you're writing your CSS and you're defining how images should be displayed, instead of setting a specific width for images, you just say, well, let's make images as big as they are, but we'll set a maximum. We'll set the maximum width of 100%. So that means if you display a 400 pixel image on your screen, if you don't specify a width, it'll display at 400 pixels. But as the screen gets smaller and the screen becomes less than 400 pixels wide, the image will now have to resize because its maximum width is defined to be 100%, and that's 100% of the width of the screen. So it means when the screen gets narrower, the image just gets narrower too. So that's just one little bit of CSS, and you've handled your fluid images, as they're called. We remember I talked about fluid grids as well, the columns getting narrower. And that's just a matter of making sure that when you define the width of your div elements, a div is just a block of content in a web page, you use percentages again. You use percentages for the width, just like I use percentage for the maximum width there, and use percentages for margins, so that as the overall width of the viewport gets less, the margins get less, the widths of the blocks of content get less. And then also what you can do is, the way you make columns side by side in HTML is you use the float property. You have a div and you set it to float left, and that puts that bit of content on the left, and then any other div will go beside it. So all you've got to do is, when you get to that break point of saying, now we're on a very tiny screen, we don't want those blocks of content to be next to each other, you just set the float property to be none. And that means, instead of going next to each other, they'll just go one after the other. So that's what we do for smaller screens. So pretty simple. And the final thing is, how do we know, how are we able to detect whether it's a small screen or a large screen? So how do we know when we need to set float to none? Well, that comes down to this bit of magic which appeared in CSS3, which is the third sort of iteration of cascading style sheets, these thing called media queries. And they are really the key to responsive web design. So I'll just talk for a second about media queries. Media queries, they're the key to it. They enable you to change the format and the layout based on the width of the viewport. As I say, they came in CSS3, and effectively, they're conditional styles. They enable you to say something like, if the screen size is less than 400 pixels, then set the float property for divs to none. so that the blocks of content go one on top of the other. If the width is above 400 pixels or above 800 pixels, then set the float property to left. It's pretty much that's what these web media queries are doing. They are conditional. Think if this, then that. And just to show you a bit of code, and it's not tricky, and once you've seen this code, you'll see it again and again, because there's nothing different. These media queries are always the same. What you're going to do this is one option anyway. I only have one style sheet for my conference website. So in my style sheet, what I'm doing is something like this, not exactly this, but I'm putting a bit of code that says, effectively, this is saying, if the user is viewing this on a screen and the screen is less than 810 pixels wide, okay, that's the maximum width, then set the styles as they're within these pair of brackets. So I might have a list of styles here. I've just given you one example. So in my very simple example here, I'm saying if the screen width is less than 810 pixels, then make headings green. Now what I'd have above this if statement is a whole load of styles in the main part of my style sheet that said how my styles should be otherwise. So what you've got is a normal style sheet that defines perhaps my headings as black or red, but this little statement at the bottom says, but if the width of the screen is less than 800 pixels, then set the headings to be green. And then you'd see if I squeezed up my browser, the headings would suddenly go at that breakpoint of 810 pixels. My headings would change to green. It's as simple as that. All right, and that's what it does. Now, there is another way of doing this. What you can do is you can write multiple style sheets. You could have a style sheet for desktop, style sheet for tablets, and a style sheet for phones. And then what you'd do in your HTML, in the head section of your page, you'd have a line like this that said, link to this style sheet, but only when, again, here's our media query. This is a slightly more complicated one because this is saying the width is between 401 and 809. So what we've got here is a sort of tablet-sized screen. So if the screen is in this range, use this style sheet. And then I'd probably have two other linked statements that said, but if the width is above 809, use the desktop style sheet. If the width is less than 401, then use the phone style sheet. So I'd have three different style sheets. That's not the way I've done it on my site, but that's one possibility. And I drew this for anyone who is bothered by the code. This is a sort of more conceptual demonstration of what I've just been talking about. Here's a typical page. This big outer box is the viewport, the browser area. This is the body of the page, so I've set some margins here. And notice I've set them in percentage terms. Here's a block of content, which has a width defined as 42%. That's 42% of the body. 16% margin. Hopefully those three numbers add up to 100. I've tried to work that out. And this column is floating left, so the other column is beside it. And there we've got an image. That's the 100% I was talking about earlier. Now look, if I squeeze the viewport up a bit, nothing's ruined. Everything's still visible because of those percentage values. Everything still fits on the screen. There's still 42% of the body, which has been squeezed, is now narrower, and the image has got smaller. And when I get beyond the break point, then suddenly the second column of text is going below because its float property has been set to none. And I've done that using a media query. Okay? I hope that makes sense to the more visually oriented of you. How am I doing for time? Okay. Oh. Right. Case study, very quickly then. This is, as you saw, what the website looked like. This is how it was a year ago. I made a few assumptions, and I may well have been wrong with some of these assumptions. I thought about when are people going to be using desktop, when are they going to be using mobile. I thought, well, people sort of generally researching the conference, they're probably likely to be at work because it's a sort of work-oriented conference. They're probably going to be on a desktop or laptop. They're almost certainly going to be a desktop or laptop when they register. So in other words, I haven't really got to make sure that the registration process is responsive. I can get away without doing that because I don't expect people to register on their mobile phone. However, our delegates may want to check up, oh, yeah, I just want to check when's that session by Rachel, or when's Karen speaking, or what time does the conference start, or how do I get to the conference? These are all things they probably want to do on a mobile device, and certainly when they're traveling to the conference, they're going to be using their mobile devices. So I try to think about what kind of information is important and try and make that information visible and easy to access in the mobile view of the site, whereas other things were more obvious in the desktop view of the site. The techniques I used were that I needed, because I want some things to be prominent on desktop and some things prominent on mobile, I need to be able to show or hide specific bits of the site. And this turned out to be very easy. All I have to do is wrap a div around a bit of content and give it a class of desktop only. This is a bit like applying a condition. You know, we're all used to working with condition tags, aren't we, in content? So that's effectively what I've done here. I've put in a class attribute which is saying, oh, this is desktop only, and here's one that's saying this is mobile only. And then what I can do in my CSS, and remember, I'm not a programmer or a web developer, so this is, you know, this is simple stuff. I could just in my CSS say, when it's a desktop-only class, display it. When it's a mobile-only class, don't display it. Setting the display property to none makes that content invisible. But, that's what's in the main part of the CSS, but remember the if bit at the end. This is saying, but if the user has got a screen that's less than 810 pixels wide, then reverse it. Then hide the desktop stuff and show the mobile stuff, okay? So if you're used to conditions, this is trivial. This is simple stuff. Okay, it's code, but it's not complicated code, and I don't want you to worry about the specifics of the code. Another thing you saw is that we have this navigation pane on the left-hand side that disappears on desktop view. That was, again, I didn't have to rewrite the site. We already had a div for the content, and it already had an ID of content. We already had a div for the navigation. And by the way, I wrote this site years ago, having heard a presentation that said you should always position content divs before navigation divs for accessibility reasons, because it's more important that screen readers access content, that screen readers get right into the content. So even though the navigation is actually on the left, the content is first in the HTML. The navigation, though, has a float property that floats it to the left and content to the right. Anyway, in the CSS, it's really just a matter of saying, content for the large screen will float to the right, nav will go beside it. For the small screen, again, don't worry about the detail. All it is that for the small screen, set the float property for content to be none, and the navigation div, display none again. Don't show the navigation pane. And again, look, we've got the if statement above it. This is if the screen is less than 800 pixels wide. So this goes in that if section at the bottom. And what we did, in fact, was we added this little menu at the top, and we can determine what goes in that menu for the mobile devices depending on what screen they're on. So we've got this top bar div, which is hidden for desktop, but shows, and in fact, it's a little bit fancy, it's actually set to display, where is it? Position fixed. Position fixed means it doesn't scroll down. As you scroll down on a mobile phone, that navigation bar actually doesn't scroll away. It stays at the top of the screen. It's a bit like a non-scrolling region. you'll have access to all these slides so you can pick away at the code later on. The way we handle the images as well, I think I'll skip over that. You can refer to this code later on. They're just all examples of the way we dealt, and this was all retrofitted to the existing site. And I was surprised at how little. It's the odd additional div and the additional class in the HTML and writing the extra media query styles in my style sheet. Before I finish, I just want to mention tools, because some of you don't want to get your hands dirty with code. I quite understand that. A tool like RoboHelp will actually handle this for you. It will enable you to define how you want the layout to be for desktop and how you want it to be different for mobile, and you can do that in a nice visual editor. This is the latest version of RoboHelp. You literally have this sort of nice visual editor that shows you how the layout's going to look, and you can choose certain settings. It's all just drop-downs. There's no code involved. You can even set up your own media queries by defining, remember those breakpoints? You set the width, the minimum and maximum widths. You just type those in as numbers, and RoboHelp will write the code with all the curly brackets and the right syntax. And what I did here, for example, is I set up my hyperlinks in RoboHelp to be twice as big when the phone media query was being satisfied. So when it's being displayed on a phone-sized screen, suddenly my hyperlinks will be twice as big to make it easy for people to click on them. And I could do that easily in RoboHelp without any code. Flare has a very similar editor for editing these responsive layouts. You just have to choose this option, enable responsive output in the target for HTML5, and then again you've got a sort of WYSIWYG editor that allows you to define the left-hand panel and how it'll look different for mobile and for tablet. So that's how it looks on mobile, and that was how it looked on desktop. A nice WYSIWYG editor. There is no direct support for media queries, but there's nothing to stop you just writing this little bit of code yourself in the style sheet with Flare. Very simple. I was going to talk about Ditter, but all I'll do is give a quick advert for Oxygen and Antidot. I'm not sure if Antidot are here, but they both have tools that enable you to take Ditter content and make it responsive using these nice kind of layouts. And so if you're into Ditter, that's one possibility. Another possibility is to pull your Ditter content into Flare and then use the Flare responsive HTML5 output, or into ePublisher and use WebWorks Reverb, which is another responsive HTML5 output. There's my list of resources and references. Everything I showed you is somewhere in that list, all the articles, lots of clever stuff, which I didn't have time to talk about. So do get into this, even if you don't have to be coding it, but you need to be aware of it, and you need to be flat. You need to be going back to your organizations and saying, is our content responsive? If not, it should be. And it's easy to do, because Matthew managed to do it on his website, and he's not a programmer. Okay? So that's it. More resources. Final thing is, I haven't got any gifts to throw out or chocolates to give you, but if you go to this URL and enter your contact details, you can download all the slides from our last UA Europe conference, which was in Krakow only 3 months ago. So make a note of that if you're interested in that. And I won't bug you very much afterwards. I'll just send you news of when our next conference is.
We can 5 minutes for questions, though.
Okay, thank you. Right, questions. There must be some questions, surely.
Firstly, how do you deal with the issue of a mobile screen that's 5 inches, desktop screen that's, say, 14 inches, but the mobile has more pixels?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. In fact, one of the things I skipped over is because the mobile phone screens, the iPhone 6 has just about come out. I don't know what the exact resolution of the screen is, but I suspect it's very high, and I suspect it's more than my laptop was about 4 years ago. The secret to making all this work is to put a line of code, make sure that your web pages all have this line of code in. It's literally just one line of code in the HTML. And if you do that, it effectively treats mobile devices, even if they've got an incredibly high resolution, as if they had a resolution, a sort of standard resolution of, I think, about 350 pixels. It just suddenly, by putting this line of code, because I didn't know about this when I first did my site, and I was developing the site, and then I looked at it on my phone, and it looked like that. I thought, hang on, I've put in these media queries, they're not working, it's because my mobile phone does have a very high resolution. When I put that single line of code, if you Google that line of code, it's mentioned by every developer who's into responsive web design, then magically, next time I looked at the site on my phone, it looked like that. Hi, yeah. Yeah, that's true. There are, and you can specify the device size. There are different ways of doing the media queries. I was doing it with straight just the number of pixels. And one of the reasons I did that is I guess I did want that if the user made their browser small on their desktop, I thought, well, it kind of makes sense then that I do make the site responsive. But there are ways of doing it with EMS, with device width, all sorts of different ways. Yeah, you're right. I've just kind of touched the tip of the iceberg, really, on the topic. Anything else? Good questions. Yeah.
So you were saying earlier that you sort of made assumptions about what people would like.
Yeah.
On the
Yes. Yeah.
I suppose what I'm asking is, would it have been more work for you to just make them all more accessible on the mobile? Did you make some decisions based on your assumptions, or was it really just assumptions made for time allowances?
It was partly that. It was partly time allowances, yes. And it was also partly, if we go back to that little toolbar I put on, we added to the mobile site, sort of very limited amount of space there, and I didn't want to clutter this toolbar with too many options. So I tried to think about what are the options that are most important to people if they're on a mobile device. So registration is not there as an option. But flights is, and sessions and agenda, because I thought, well, these are, and you know, there's no way of finding out about previous years. So I was thinking about people on their way to the conference, what are the things that are likely to be important to them. That's what I had in mind. But you're right, it was partly to do with the fact that I had limited time to do all of this, and it was going to be quite a lot of work to make sure the registration form, for example, was going to work on a mobile phone. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry. One more. Okay.
Not so much question as a beg to differ.
Go on. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
You said that the content, in most cases, you don't need to change the content. I did see, I think, Karen Graham talk about Amazon and the descriptions of the products, and when you see them on a mobile device, they're just loads and loads of text and too big.
Right.
And one of the things she was arguing is they should use short desk or another way of truncating product descriptions so they weren't so text heavy.
Right. Yes. They could use progressive disclosure, maybe. That would be a very good example of when that would be useful. Because I hate the thought of denying access to some content just because people are on a mobile device. One good example of that is when I tried to book a flight with Flybe last year on my mobile, I found that for some reason, even though I'm a Flybe member and I've registered before, so they have my address details, I couldn't log in. I could only book the flight without being logged in on my mobile. That was incredibly frustrating and annoying. So I don't think we can make too many assumptions about what people should or shouldn't be allowed to do on a mobile phone.
Well, thank you very much. And before we thank Matthew for his excellent session, can I remind you please to fill out your feedback form on the SurveyMonkey link that was sent around to you beforehand on email. And again, I thought this was a very useful session. I'm not sure I have any use for this in the immediate future on a mobile device, but excellent.
Great, thank you,
Matt.
thank you.